Despite Blizzard labeling Evokers as an advanced class, don't let that turn you away from either spec, because both of them are probably some of the simplest specs in the entire game. As a quick explanation of how Preservation plays, you basically juggle three fundamental elements of gameplay. You use your empowered cast abilities, which is Dream Breath, Spirit Bloom, and Fire Breath. They all have cooldowns, and between those you spend your essence. You can either spend your essence on Disintegrate, which only does damage, but don't press that because it does no damage, or on Emerald Blossom, or on Echo. And between those two things, you basically either spam Living Flame, you apply Reversion to allies, or you press Temporal Anomaly. That is pretty much it, apart from cooldowns. Cooldowns you have as Preservation are extremely strong. Probably the strongest cooldowns of any healer. Your tank cooldown, or external, is Time Dilation. Every 1 minute for 8 seconds, you can cause an ally to be dealt 50% of the damage they would take over 8 seconds instead. With talents, if you want to, you can bring that up to 70%. It's really good. And your main raid healing cooldown is Rewind, which is disgustingly strong. All of that strength basically comes from 50% of damage taken in the last 5 seconds by all allies is healed back to them, which is just crazy. If you're in a situation where everyone takes a huge chunk of damage, if everyone, for example, takes half of their health as damage, then pressing Rewind is 25% of your raid's health in one button. It's crazy strong. And the other short-term cooldown is Verdant Embrace. And that is your basic healing toolkit, pretty much. If you want to as well, Temporal Anomaly can be excellent. It has a couple of good talents based around it as well, but it has an insanely high mana cost, but a very short cooldown. And it has a heavy positioning / aiming requirement. Now, out of those three fundamental elements of gameplay that you're juggling by playing Preservation, there's really only one major mechanic that interacts between the three, and that is Leaping Flames as a talent. So after you Fire Breath, each stage of empowerment that you reach when you cast the ability, you gain a buff that causes your next Living Flame to strike one additional target. Now, there's a passive that allows your Living Flame to have a chance to proc Essence Burst, which makes your next Essence casted ability cost no Essence. So the interaction is basically, if you Fire Breath for maximum empowerment, gain a buff like this one that'll cause my next Living Flame to strike 4 additional targets, so 5 total, and each of those 5 hits has the chance to proc the Essence Burst, which means you can almost always get an Essence Burst from your Fire Breath if you have the time to cast both abilities. And there's a few talents that interact with all of the abilities I've outlined so far, obviously. None of them are particularly noteworthy, at least in my opinion, other than, I think, Temporal Anomaly with the Resonating Sphere talent that allows your Temporal Anomaly to apply Echo at 30% of effectiveness is really strong. Everything else, all the other talents, don't really affect your gameplay too much. I mean, getting 1 extra essence and getting 1 extra level of empowerment and giving you a few random procs here and there. But for the most part, your talents don't alter your gameplay terribly, unless you're taking something like Stasis, but I'll probably get into the capstones later on and complain about them. But first I'll complain about the rest of Preservation, I guess. So just off the top of my head, okay, so to preface the complaining, Preservation at the moment has extremely powerful stacked group healing, but unfortunately that's about it. Oh, and it has, like I said before, it has really good cooldowns. But apart from those things, that's really all it does. And then the question of whether or not Preservation is good in its current state, or whether it will be fun to play, or if you should play it, really comes down to the balance of those things. Are you happy playing a healer that is really good at one particular thing and terrible at everything else? And if you're okay, if you're happy with just being really good at stacked group AoE healing, then Preservation can be really fun. Juggling those 3 elements of gameplay has a fair bit of nuance to it. It can be really fun, and it moves health bars very well, I guess. Out of all of the healers, if your entire party of 5 people, let's say, in a Mythic Plus, takes a huge amount of damage, Preservation can top those health bars like no other healer can. but it also sucks at everything else. So if you have to heal a single target, you're kind of shit out of luck, I guess. Most of your AoE heals are stronger than any of your spot heals. I'll also say that at the moment, the strength of stacked AoE healing is entirely conditional on tuning. Preservation, in my opinion, at the moment is very numerically overtuned. As an example, with Dream Breath, every 20 seconds, you could crit your entire party with 100k heal if you wanted to. Which, if most of your party has 160, 70,000 health, that's a large heal. And that can get even higher with other talents and interactions like Verdant Embrace with all of your Sarah. Buffs your Dream Breath by 40%. You can also tack a hot onto your Dream Breath and things like that. You can, the throughput you can get is immense. And I'm not sure if that throughput is just numerically higher than it should be, and eventually it will get brought down and the other aspects of preservation healing will get brought up to make a more well-rounded healing spec. But also that might not happen, and preservation could just do crazy AoE healing and not much else. And when I say not much else, I'm talking about mobility. For whatever reason, people have this idea that preservation evokers with hover charges have good mobility, and they have these, big cooldowns that can move them 50 or 60 yards across the map. And while they do have that, the base mobility of preservation is possibly the worst of any class in the game. It feels worse than Paladins, and part of that is that hover allows you to cast while moving, but it doesn't allow for empowered casts while moving, which basically means you can press hover and the only things you can actually cast is Echo or Living Flame. Both of them are extremely weak heals, in my opinion. The major problem with Echo is that it costs 2 essence, and most of the healing you want to tack onto Echo also requires or costs essence, which makes me think that Blizzard have this idea that Echo, which if you don't know, is just a short cast time ability that costs 2 essence. You cast it on a single target. It applies a buff to that target for, I believe, 18 seconds. That will replicate 105% in this case. It's usually 70% of healing, but in this case it's 105 because I've talented for extra replicated healing. But whatever you cast next that isn't an Echo spell will be replicated to the targets that have Echo on them. So it's sort of like Disc's Atonement, in that you pre-apply a buff, and then when you want to do big throughput, you press a different button and that healing is replicated onto other targets. The problem I have with Echo is that it feels like Blizzard have designed it because it has an essence cost. It feels like it's meant to be comboed with abilities that don't have an essence cost. The problem with that is that healing from non-essence costing abilities already does such crazy amounts of throughput that, as an example, if I was going to Echo 2 or 3 or even 4 people in my group before a big damaging event came out, and then after they took damage, I wanted to heal them up with Dream Breath or Spirit Bloom, my big empowered cast healing abilities, it would be overkill. Because these abilities already do so much healing that I'll probably top my group by just casting them without needing Echo. The way I've been playing around this in beta is by using Temporal Anomaly with the Resonating Sphere talent, which causes my Temporal Anomaly, which shoots out in front of me like a frozen orb. And when it hits an ally, it will slow down, and it will apply an Absorb Shield to them, and also Echo. So the next ability I cast will Echo to those targets. Like I said, the throughput is pretty insane. But it makes me wonder why Echo is relevant at all. As far as single target healing goes, you don't have any. Reversion does very little healing. You're talking like, I don't know, 1 flash heal's worth of healing over a 12-second period, which is not ideal. And then your casted direct single target heal is Living Flame, which does, I don't know, 30, 35% less healing than a normal flash heal on a Holy Paladin or a Holy Priest or any other healer with a similar ability. So you often find yourself in situations where you just AoE heal all the time, and if one person takes way more damage than anybody else in the group, it doesn't matter because your AoE heals are so strong that they're your best single target heals anyway, which kind of, it feels weird. It feels like you don't ever shift the style of your play. You always just do the same thing no matter what damage patterns are going out. Doesn't matter if one person's taking damage or 3 people are taking damage, or the tank is getting absolutely destroyed, or your entire group is dying. You always just rotate and press the same abilities pretty much all the time. The only thing that changes is when you use your cooldowns. And I could imagine some people liking that sort of playstyle. It reminds me of, I'm guessing, what Demon Hunter plays like, where your single target and your AoE ability or rotations are basically the same. Same with Windwalker. You basically just do the same thing in AoE as you do in single target. And I can see that having appeal to some people, but at the same time, it makes the spec feel quite shallow. As far as mobility goes, you don't have any. You have Hover. Now, if talented, Hover has 2 charges and it gives you a little boost if you're moving while pressing it. But I often find myself using Hover not to cast while moving, but just to catch up to people in my party. I found that Preservation was really quite fun early on in beta in Heroics, because I was still just learning the spec and getting used to it and trying to figure out how I was going to react to different damage patterns and things like that. But once I sat down and looked at the numbers and got more experience in the dungeons, I ended up just almost always playing the same way, regardless of what was happening. And I found, especially recently in the past day, doing a few Mythic Plus keys as Preservation was an extremely painful experience, especially with the new Mythic Plus affix Thundering. Groups always want to spread out, and I always want them to stack together. And that does not play well at all. Then you have the added issue of tanks, or almost every other spec in the game, having significantly better mobility than Preservation, in that, especially if you're playing with a Vengeance Demon Hunter or a Brewmaster or even a Warrior that's going to Leap Slam Charge and things like that, or Demon Hunters that leap away, Brewmasters that roll into the next pack, you are going to be constantly trying to chase your teammates that are just plain faster than you all the time, which feels quite bad. And then there's also the variability of group compositions. I remember back even playing in Heroic dungeons, if I played with a group that was all melee, then Preservation could feel quite fun and I could do crazy throughput for my item level. The dungeons almost felt too easy, like I just wanted people to pull bigger and people to take more damage because I was doing so much healing, or I had so much healing ready to go all of the time, but never needed it. But then going into the same dungeons with a group of 2 or 3 ranged was absolutely horrible. Just because all of those targets were too spread out for any of my heals to overlap on multiple targets. So I would end up having to use AoE healing to single target heal, but not having enough AoE healing or enough being able to fit enough casts in to quickly heal up a few people. The other part of the Preservation toolkit that I found quite enjoyable in Heroics was Verdant Embrace. You leap to a nearby target and heal them up, and then there's a talent that replicates some of the healing you take in the next few seconds onto the target that you leapt to. Now, I found this very good for spot healing. If someone was standing in the fire or eating boss mechanics or something that they shouldn't be doing, I could Verdant Embrace to them and just drop a Blossom or a Dream Breath or something, and I would heal them myself, and then that would also replicate or cleave back to them so I could heal them up again. And Verdant Embrace itself is quite strong healing. I think it's 300-ish% spell power. It's double a normal flash heal or something like that for another healer in that kind of ballpark. So that felt quite good for spot healing, especially on a short cooldown reduced by haste. The problem I had going into Mythic Plus is that usually the people that I needed to spot heal needed that healing because they were eating mechanics, and me flying to them just meant that now 2 people were eating mechanics. Didn't go well at all. And then obviously with Thundering in the past couple of days being added to the beta, you've got groups that just constantly want to spread out. No one stands on top of each other. And healing in those environments on a Preservation Evoker feels horrible. The other exceptionally weak part of the spec, well, deceptively weak part of preservation is defensive cooldowns. Defensive cooldowns of preservation, I would say, are the weakest of any healer, and it isn't close. You can press both Obsidian Scales and Renewing Blaze with the talent to make it even better or shorter cooldown, and there were many times, even in heroic dungeons, where I would press my defensives and die, and I would think that I had maybe fat fingered them or they didn't go off because I was stunned or they were bugged or something happened. But no, I would look down at my cooldowns and see that I had pressed them and I didn't even notice because they were so weak. The only real exception here is Emerald Communion, which is very strong. But this isn't really a defensive. I mean, it will be in PvP, but for all intents and purposes, it is a big heal, not a defensive cooldown. It basically heals you a lot, the 3-minute cooldown, and if any overhealing done to you will instead spread to another ally. So it can be quite a large healing cooldown to use, but I wouldn't really classify it as a true defensive because it doesn't increase your effective health pool or your effective life in any way. Mastery. Preservation Mastery increases healing done to allies whose health is a lower percentage than yours. This is numerically really quite strong. You can see even here for a rough ballpark figure, I have almost 2600 critical strike, which increases my crit by 14.36%. And I have roughly the same, a little bit more of this mastery stat, and it increases my healing on eligible targets by almost 28%. So it's quite good numerically. The problem I have with it is how it works in practice. There are a lot of situations where it is a huge bonus to your healing, but in any situation where you're taking damage along with your party, there's a good chance that you get no benefit from your mastery, and it does absolutely nothing to help you heal yourself in PvP. Okay, I guess the last major criticism of preservation is the range limit. Now, I know it's gone up to 30 yards now. Damaging abilities are still 25, which feels really bad. But most of everything else has gone up to 30. It feels slightly better, but it still doesn't... Having an additional range doesn't change the way you play preservation. It doesn't really help your lack of mobility. It doesn't do anything to change the dynamic of being a healer that excels with stacked group healing and does nothing else. Now, when I say nothing else, obviously that's exaggeration. But I think the big issues here is that reversion is extremely weak. Echo feels poorly designed and weak at the same time. I would really like to see Echo either cost 1 essence or no essence, or go on a cooldown and be instant cast, or just be instant cast. It needs something. I like the idea of setting up Echoes to then leverage throughput to them with other spells, but the spec doesn't really favor that style of play at the moment. But then let's say that you were going to Echo a target and then use Emerald Blossom. Well, you've just used 25 seconds of your essence regeneration, which, by the way, you recover or you gain 1 essence every 5 seconds. Apparently this is meant to be reduced by haste. I don't really feel it. I don't have a good way of testing it without a stopwatch, and I'm far too lazy for that. I imagine it does work that way. Now, there was a lot of talk early on in the beta that haste didn't affect the cast time of your empowered spells, which apparently it does, even though I would say it doesn't really feel like it does. Having very long empowered casts feels horrible if you have to move. That shouldn't really come as a shock to anyone. And if it was only 1 or maybe even 2, but if it was probably only 1 major long cast, it is something I feel like you could play around or plan around. But the problem is that preservation really revolves around using 3 of them very often. Like, you'll be using Fire Breath every 30 seconds, almost guaranteed. You'll be using Dream Breath probably every 20 to 30 seconds. And the same thing with Spirit Bloom, which means you're pressing a long 3.5 second cast like 6 times a minute. You're pressing one of these buttons every 10 seconds. So if you're using all of your empowered casts in situation, obviously you won't be pressing them all the time for no reason. But let's say you're in a situation where your throughput matters and you're trying to pump out as much healing as possible. you will be pressing an empowered cast every 10 seconds, which means out of every 10 seconds, you're going to be spending at least 30% of that time rooted in place. And if you have to move for a mechanic or something, it doesn't incur the cooldown if you don't finish the cast, but it still feels bad to be wasting any real amount of time on a spell that you don't get to finish. As far as talents go, the class tree doesn't feel like there are that many options. Playing Preservation, you are always going to go down this right side, and you're always going to take at least all of these talents in the main column on the right hand side. I also can't really imagine a Preservation build that doesn't have Leaping Flames, or at least not a good build. So you end up in this position where you're locked into, it feels like you're locked into a lot of talents. You're always going to take Innate Magic. You're always going to take Tip the Scales. You're always going to take all of these talents on the right-hand side. You probably want both defensives, even though they suck. You still need defensives. Like, even if they're weak, you still have to take them. If anything, them being weak means that if anything, it makes it feel like both are mandatory, which leaves you really not many points to specialize into anything else, which makes the class tree feel a little limiting. As far as the spec tree goes, I would almost give it the same criticism as the class tree. There are certain abilities that you just have to take. You have to take Spirit Bloom. I would say you have to take Power Nexus to get your essence up to a maximum of 6, because if you don't, you won't be able to press Emerald Blossom back to back. You won't be able to press Echo on three times if you really want to. Now, there's going to be some absolute meme builds out there as well with Stasis. You can play some crazy builds with Stasis. My criticism of Stasis is that it's effectively, even though it says it's a 90-second cooldown, 1.5 minutes, it's effectively always a 2-minute cooldown, because you have to use the spells and then reactivate it anytime within 30 seconds after pressing it. But it doesn't go on cooldown until you've done that, until you've used it. And when I say some meme builds, you can take Stasis, you can store 3 Temporal Anomalies with Resonating Sphere to get Echo on 18 people in absolutely ideal situations, even though it's probably going to be more like 10, maybe 15. And then you could replicate onto those targets a juiced Dream Breath with Call of Ysera, giving it the 40% buff from using Verdant Embrace. It's a little... I mean, I can't imagine this being a legitimate build, because you would effectively be pressing nothing for like 15 seconds other than just 3 Temporal Anomalies. But Stasis does have some fairly interesting options. It doesn't fix any of the issues I've outlined though. It gives you an extra cooldown effectively if you want it. Cycle of Life is only good in Raid, which is a little boring. And so is Dragonflight. So it feels like the spec tree is a little bit of a pick your poison. You either take a big 2-minute cooldown where you get to shoot across the map and heal everyone in your path, or you get some higher passive throughput from your Emerald Blossoms. Both of these are really raid talents. As far as the often talked about range limitation goes, I actually don't have that much of an issue with the lack of range, the 30 yards compared to 40 or 45 for Resto Druids. The issue I have is the lack of mobility. I think the range would be fine if I had exceptional mobility, but Preservation just doesn't have that. It has Hover. That's pretty much it. And Hover just doesn't cut it. Because at the end of the day, you're not using Verdant Embrace to move, you're using it to heal. You're not using Dragonflight to move, you're using it to heal. You're not using Deep Breath to move, you're using it to do damage on big packs. Which means you're left with the option to talent into Hover having 2 charges, and talent into Hover giving you a 70% move speed buff. But it's just not enough. Especially for a spec that, like I said before, spends a lot of time locked in place using empowered abilities. It really doesn't feel like it has the mobility to make up for that, let alone make up for the range limitation. As far as utility goes, Preservation has an okay amount of it, and the major benefit is that usually most of what it has is unique. Things like Zephyr and Time Spiral and Source of Magic, giving healers mana, all seem quite strong. Being able to knock enemies up, being able to remove bleeds and things with Cauterize, and then knock back. is quite a lot of utility. It feels difficult to take it, like I said, with the class tree being a little bit overloaded with points that feel mandatory, but the utility is at least there if you want it, and like I said, it's at least mostly unique. I also think that Preservation is one bad tuning pass away from being quite literally the worst healer in the game, and it wouldn't be close. At the moment, all I can say that they have going for them is very numerically strong AoE stacked healing that you can do while you're standing in one spot, not having to move. It feels very feast or famine. And if you're trying to heal spread out targets, if you're trying to chase targets down to heal them, if you need to heal on the move, if you need to heal a single target, if you need to triage heal 2 targets that are spread out, if you need to keep the tank alive, if any of these things happen, Preservation begins to feel very flawed, unfortunately. So take all of this, I guess, with a large grain of salt. If you are happy to play around limitations and you're happy for the reward for that, at least at the moment, to be exceptionally high throughput, and Preservation, it is still quite fun to play. The basic elements of juggling the 3 aspects of the class I discussed at the beginning of the video is enjoyable. It's good. And there's enough nuance there for the most part to at least make that enjoyable. You can alter the abilities you press and the way you play and the order in which you use abilities. And it is definitely the healer that is punished the most for bad positioning, but that also conversely means that it's the healer that shines the most with good positioning, and probably the real difference between good evokers and great evokers is going to be positioning. So if you're happy to min-max those kind of aspects of the class, then Preservation can be quite enjoyable. But anyway, algorithm stuff. Thanks.